The quiet before the storm. The streets of Liberty Heights were unusually empty that evening. Rain fell in steady sheets, drumming against the pavement as streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood. Nathan Wright, a 79-year-old man with a lifetime of stories etched into his weathered face, walked down the damp sidewalk with measured steps. The soft rhythm of his cane tapping against the ground blended with the patter of rain. To anyone passing by, he was just an elderly man, perhaps running a late-night errand. But Nathan was far more than he appeared. Dressed in a simple windbreaker and jeans, Nathan's unassuming appearance belied a lifetime of discipline and strength. He had served in the military for over 2 decades, a veteran of battles most people only read about in history books. The years had slowed his gait and added lines to his face, but his mind remained sharp, and his instincts, honed by years of training, were as sharp as ever. A routine errand. Nathan approached the lone ATM, tucked beneath a small awning at the corner of the street. He needed cash to pay for groceries the next morning, a routine he followed every week. As he slipped his card into the machine, he let out a small sigh, his mind drifting to memories of his younger days. He thought of the jungles where he had led his unit, the camaraderie he had shared with his comrades, and the sacrifices they had all made. Those experiences had shaped him, taught him the value of resilience and courage. But tonight, Nathan wasn't thinking about heroics. He was simply trying to withdraw $40 and head home to his cozy apartment, where a cup of tea and a book awaited him. A shadow in the rain. Nathan's instincts kicked in before his mind fully registered the danger. He noticed the shadowy figure lingering just beyond the ATM's reflection, moving with deliberate intent. His senses sharpened, and his hand froze over the keypad. He didn't turn around immediately, choosing instead to observe the figure through the reflective surface of the ATM screen. The young man approached quickly, his steps splashing in the shallow puddles. Nathan noted the details, his unkempt clothes, the hoodie pulled low over his face, and the telltale glint of metal in his hand. A knife. Nathan straightened his posture, his fingers pausing over the withdraw button. He inhaled deeply, his breath steady despite the tension crackling in the air. The mugger makes his move. "Evening, old man," a voice called out from behind him. It was laced with mock friendliness, but the menace beneath it was unmistakable. Nathan turned slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. His weathered eyes met the gaze of a man no older than 25, his features sharp and hardened by a life of desperation. The mugger smirked, waving the knife casually. "Why don't you make this easy for both of us and hand over your wallet?" Nathan tilted his head slightly, studying the young man. He could see the nervous energy in his posture, the darting glances that betrayed his lack of confidence. The knife trembled slightly in his grip. Nathan's military training kicked in, cataloging every potential threat and weakness in an instant. "Son," Nathan began, his voice calm and steady, "you don't want to do this." The young man, who would later introduce himself as Tony, scoffed. "Oh, I think I do. Let's not drag this out, Grandpa." The wallet. Now. The calm before the storm. Nathan didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a soft sigh, his shoulders relaxing. "You've got some nerve pulling a stunt like this," he said, his voice laced with a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "But I'll give you one chance to walk away. No harm, no foul." Tony's smirk faltered for a split second before he doubled down on his bravado. "You think I'm bluffing? You think I won't use this?" He brandished the knife, stepping closer. Nathan's eyes narrowed slightly, the steel of his gaze cutting through the rain-soaked night. "Oh, I don't doubt you'd try," he said, "but you have no idea who you're dealing with." Tony hesitated, his confidence waning under Nathan's unflinching stare. Something about the old man's presence unnerved him. He had mugged people before, scared, panicked victims who handed over their belongings without question. But this man wasn't reacting the way he expected. "Last chance," Tony growled, his tone faltering. "Hand it over, or I'll." Before he could finish the sentence, Nathan made his move. A veteran's response. Years of training had conditioned Nathan to act without hesitation. In a blur of motion, he grabbed Tony's wrist, twisting it with precise force. The knife clattered to the ground, its metallic clang echoing in the empty street. In the same fluid motion, Nathan spun Tony around, pinning his arm behind his back with an iron grip. Tony yelped in pain, struggling against Nathan's hold, but it was futile. Despite his age, Nathan's strength and technique were unmatched. He tightened his grip just enough to prevent Tony from breaking free, but not enough to cause serious harm. "Now," Nathan said, his voice calm but commanding, "let's talk about the choices you're making." Tony squirmed, panic setting in. "What the hell, man? Let me go." Nathan ignored his protests, his grip firm. "You think you're tough because you've got a knife. Let me tell you something, son. I've faced men with far more dangerous weapons than that, and I'm still standing." A moment of clarity. Nathan loosened his grip slightly, allowing Tony to turn and face him. The young man's eyes widened as he got a closer look at the man he had tried to rob. Nathan's posture was steady, his expression calm but tinged with pity. "Who are you?" Tony stammered, his bravado shattered. Nathan straightened, his weathered face illuminated by the faint glow of the ATM screen. "I'm someone who's seen too much violence in this world," he said, "and I'm not about to let you add to it." Tony's breath came in ragged gasps as the weight of the situation sank in. He had misjudged this man, badly. This wasn't just an elderly man out for a late-night errand. This was someone who had faced far greater challenges than a mugger with a knife. An unexpected decision. Nathan released Tony, stepping back and gesturing to the knife on the ground. "Pick it up if you want," he said, his tone almost dismissive. "But if you do, you'd better be ready for what comes next." Tony stared at the knife, his mind racing. He felt exposed, vulnerable. For the first time in years, he felt truly powerless, not because of the man's strength, but because of the overwhelming presence he exuded. Slowly, Tony raised his hands in surrender. "I'm done," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Nathan nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Good choice," he said. "Now let's talk about how you can make better ones." As the rain continued to fall, the two men stood under the awning, their confrontation giving way to an unexpected conversation, one that would change both of their lives forever. An unlikely mentor. The rain continued to pour as Nathan Wright and Tony stood face to face under the dim glow of the ATM streetlight. The metallic clang of the knife hitting the pavement still echoed in Tony's ears, but what lingered more was the overwhelming presence of the man he had tried to rob. Nathan wasn't just strong for his age. He exuded a calm authority that seemed unshakable, and it left Tony feeling vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced before. Nathan bent down, picked up the knife, and held it in his hand as though inspecting it for the first time. He glanced at Tony, his expression unreadable. "This isn't the first time you've done something like this, is it?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Tony hesitated, unsure of how to respond. His instinct was to lie, to deny everything. But something about Nathan's gaze made him feel like honesty was his only option. "No," he admitted reluctantly, looking down at the ground. Nathan nodded, slipping the knife into his pocket. "I thought as much," he said. "You've got the look of someone who's been doing this for a while. But tell me, son, has it ever gotten you anything worth keeping?" A young man's desperation. Tony's jaw clenched. "What do you know about it?" He shot back, his voice defensive. "You don't know what it's like to be me. You don't know what I've been through." Nathan's eyes softened, and he folded his arms across his chest. "You're right. I don't know your story," he said. "But I know this much. The path you're on doesn't lead anywhere good. It didn't for the men I've seen take it before you, and it won't for you either." Tony looked up, his frustration bubbling over. "What choice do I have?" He snapped. "You think I want to be out here, robbing people just to get by? You think I don't know this is messed up? I don't have anyone. No one's gonna help me. Nathan's expression remained calm, though there was a flicker of sadness in his eyes. You've convinced yourself that no one will help, so you've stopped looking for help, he said. But here's the thing, son, you're still young. You've still got time to turn things around, but not if you keep going down this road. Tony scoffed, shaking his head. Yeah. And what do you know about turning things around? You don't look like you've had a hard day in your life. The soldier's story. Nathan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. You'd be surprised, he said. I wasn't always the man you see standing here. Let me tell you something about hard days. Nathan's voice grew quieter, more reflective, as he began to recount his story. I was just a kid when I signed up for the military. Thought I could escape the rough streets of Detroit by enlisting. Turns out, war has its own kind of rough. I lost friends, men I'd called brothers. I saw things that no one should ever have to see. And when I came back home, I wasn't the same. I didn't know how to live in a world that felt so different from the one I left. Tony stared at him, caught off guard by the honesty in Nathan's tone. He had expected some kind of lecture, not a story that felt so raw and personal. For a long time, Nathan continued, I let the anger and the pain take over. I pushed people away, got into fights. I didn't think I could ever find my way back. But then I realized something. No one was going to pull me out of that darkness. I had to do it myself. And it wasn't easy. It took years. But I made a choice to fight for something better. A lesson in choices. Tony shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. So, what? You think I can just decide to change and everything will get better? He asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Nathan shook his head. It's not that simple, he said. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without effort. But it starts with a choice. You can choose to keep doing what you're doing, and I can promise you it'll only lead to more pain. Or you can choose to do better. To try. Tony frowned, his mind racing. He wanted to dismiss Nathan's words, to write them off as the ramblings of an old man who didn't understand his struggles. But something about the way Nathan spoke, the conviction in his voice, the steadiness in his gaze, made it hard to ignore. I don't even know where to start, Tony admitted after a long pause. Nathan smiled faintly. That's the first honest thing you've said all night, he replied. And it's a good start. A test of character. Nathan reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He held it out to Tony, who stared at it in confusion. Take it, Nathan said simply. Tony blinked. What? You came here for my money, didn't you? Nathan asked. So take it. If that's the kind of man you want to be, then go ahead. Tony hesitated, his eyes darting between Nathan and the wallet. I don't understand. Why are you doing this? Because I want to see what kind of man you really are, Nathan said. You've got a choice right now. You can take the money and walk away, or you can prove to yourself that you're capable of something better. Tony's hands trembled as he reached for the wallet. He held it for a moment, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. Slowly, he handed it back to Nathan, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I don't want your money, he said quietly. I don't know what I want, but it's not this. Nathan nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Good. That's a step in the right direction. A new opportunity. Nathan reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a small card. He handed it to Tony, who looked at it with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. It was a business card for a local veterans organization. They do more than just help veterans, Nathan explained. They've got programs for young men like you, job training, counseling, mentorship. If you're serious about wanting to change, this is a good place to start. Tony stared at the card, his mind spinning. Why are you doing this? He asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. Nathan's expression softened. Because I've been where you are, he said, And I know how hard it is to find your way out. But you don't have to do it alone." Tony didn't know what to say. He nodded slowly, slipping the card into his pocket. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. A quiet resolution. As the rain began to let up, Nathan and Tony stood under the awning in silence. Finally, Nathan spoke. "You've got a choice to make, son. I hope you'll make the right one." Tony nodded again, his gaze steady. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. Nathan watched as the young man turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. He let out a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy for Tony, but he also knew that everyone deserved a chance to change. As Nathan resumed his walk home, he couldn't help but smile to himself. Even at 79, life still had a way of surprising him. Paths cross again. The rain had stopped by the time Nathan reached his apartment. The soft patter of drops hitting the ground was replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional passing car. As Nathan closed his door and hung up his damp jacket, his thoughts lingered on the young man he had just encountered. He couldn't help but wonder if Tony would take his advice, or if the card he handed him would simply be tossed into the nearest trash can. Nathan wasn't naive. He knew change wasn't easy, especially for someone like Tony, who was likely entrenched in a cycle of desperation and poor choices. But Nathan had learned through his years in the military and afterward that even the smallest acts of kindness could plant a seed. It was up to the recipient to nurture it. A new routine. A week passed, and life went on. Nathan continued his quiet routines, morning walks to the park, coffee at his favorite diner, and reading the paper on his porch. He tried to push the encounter out of his mind, convincing himself that he had done all he could. But a small part of him hoped he might run into Tony again, just to see if the young man had taken the first step toward something better. One evening, Nathan found himself at the same ATM, withdrawing cash for his weekly errands. The air was crisp, and the street was alive with the sounds of distant chatter and cars honking. As he finished his transaction and turned to leave, a voice called out from behind him. "Hey, Mr. Right." Nathan turned slowly, his sharp instincts on alert. There, standing under the dim glow of the streetlight, was Tony. But he looked different this time. The defiance in his posture was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like vulnerability. He wasn't wearing the same ragged hoodie and jeans. Instead, he was dressed in a plain but clean shirt and slacks. His hands were shoved into his pockets, and he looked nervous, like a child caught sneaking out past curfew. A glimmer of hope. Nathan raised an eyebrow, but remained calm. "Tony," he said evenly, "what brings you here?" Tony hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I just wanted to say thanks," he began, his voice unsure. For not turning me in last week." Nathan nodded, his expression softening slightly. "You're here, so I'm guessing you didn't toss that card I gave you." Tony managed a small, sheepish smile. "I didn't," he admitted. "I went to that place you told me about, the Veterans Center. They got this program for job training and counseling. I signed up." Nathan's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and pride, though he kept his expression neutral. "Good to hear," he said simply. "That's a start." Tony scratched the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, I know I messed up," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of. But I don't want to be that guy anymore. I don't want to keep living like this." Nathan took a step closer, his gaze steady but kind. "Change isn't easy, son," he said. "It's going to take time, effort, and a whole lot of patience. But if you're serious about turning things around, you've already taken the hardest step. An unexpected offer." Tony nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I don't know if I can do it," he admitted, "but I want to try." Nathan studied the young man for a moment before making a decision. "Have you eaten dinner yet?" he asked. Tony blinked, caught off guard by the question. No, not yet. Well then, Nathan said, gesturing for Tony to follow him. Let's go grab a bite. There's a diner down the street that serves the best meatloaf you'll ever have. Tony hesitated for a moment before falling into step beside Nathan. The two walked in silence for a while, the noise of the city fading into the background. Tony couldn't help but feel a strange sense of comfort in Nathan's presence, like he was finally stepping out of the storm that had consumed his life for so long. Breaking bread. The diner was small and cozy, with checkered floors and the smell of fresh coffee wafting through the air. Nathan waved to the waitress behind the counter, who greeted him with a warm smile. "The usual, Mr. Wright?" she asked. "And add another plate for my friend here," Nathan replied, nodding toward Tony. The two men slid into a booth near the window. Tony fidgeted with the menu, unsure of what to say. Nathan, on the other hand, seemed perfectly at ease, leaning back in his seat and watching Tony with a quiet curiosity. "So," Nathan said after a moment, "tell me about yourself. What brought you to that ATM last week?" Tony hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of the menu. "It's a long story," he said. "I've got time," Nathan replied. Tony sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I grew up in a rough neighborhood. My mom worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. My dad, well, he wasn't around much. I dropped out of school when I was 16. Thought I could make it on my own, but it didn't take long for things to go downhill." Nathan listened intently, nodding as Tony spoke. He didn't interrupt or judge, letting the young man tell his story at his own pace. "I started hanging out with the wrong crowd," Tony continued. "Did some things I'm not proud of. At first it was just to survive, you know. But then it became something else. I guess I just got stuck." Wisdom from experience. Nathan leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Let me tell you something, Tony," he said. "Life has a way of throwing curveballs at you. Sometimes it feels like the world is stacked against you, like no matter what you do, you can't catch a break. I've been there. I felt that." Tony looked up, his eyes searching Nathan's face. "How did you get out of it?" he asked. Nathan smiled faintly. "By remembering that no matter how bad things got, I wasn't alone. I had people who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. And I learned that it's never too late to start over." Tony nodded slowly, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite put into words. For the first time in a long time, he felt like someone saw him, not just the mistakes he had made, but the person he could become. A new beginning. As their plates arrived, Nathan raised his coffee mug in a mock toast. "To new beginnings," he said, a twinkle of warmth in his eyes. Tony hesitated for a moment before clinking his glass of water against Nathan's mug. "To new beginnings," he echoed, a small but genuine smile spreading across his face. As they ate, the two men talked about everything from Nathan's time in the military to Tony's dreams of one day owning his own business. For the first time in years, Tony felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could turn his life around. And Nathan? He felt a quiet sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had done more than just stop a crime that night. He had helped someone find their way back to the light. The weight of choices, the rain that had accompanied Nathan and Tony's first encounter, had given way to clear skies and crisp autumn air. The two men had finished their meal at the diner and parted ways, but something had shifted between them. A quiet understanding, a bond formed not out of obligation but of shared humanity. For Nathan, it was another moment in a long life of service and purpose. For Tony, it was the beginning of something he had never truly experienced. Trust. A struggle to break free. The next morning, Tony stood outside the Veterans Center Nathan had recommended. The building was modest, its brick facade bearing the scars of time, but there was a sense of quiet strength about it. Tony hesitated on the steps, the card Nathan had given him clutched tightly in his hand. He had made it this far, but now doubts swirled in his mind. Could he really change? Could someone like him, with a past filled with bad choices and burned bridges, truly start over? Tony stared at the door, his fingers trembling slightly. The weight of his past seemed to pull at him, whispering in his ear that this was pointless, that he didn't belong here. But then he thought of Nathan, the calm in his voice, the strength in his stance, and the kindness in his actions. If an old man who had seen the worst of the world could still believe in him, maybe he could find a way to believe in himself. Taking a deep breath, Tony pushed open the door and stepped inside. Finding support. The Veterans Center buzzed with quiet activity. Men and women of all ages, some wearing the unmistakable weariness of combat and others with the determined energy of mentors, moved through the halls. A receptionist greeted Tony with a warm smile, her eyes filled with understanding. "Hi there," she said. "Can I help you?" Tony hesitated, feeling the weight of his decision. Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was told you might have some programs for people trying to get back on their feet." The receptionist nodded, her smile never wavering. "You've come to the right place," she said. "Why don't we sit down and talk about what you're looking for?" Tony followed her to a small office, where she introduced herself as Karen. Over the next hour, she listened as Tony shared his story, the struggles, the mistakes, and the faint glimmer of hope that had brought him here. Karen didn't judge or interrupt. She simply listened, her pen moving swiftly across a notepad. When Tony finished, she handed him a folder filled with information about job training programs, counseling services, and community support groups. "This is a starting point," she said. "You don't have to do everything at once. Just take it one step at a time." Tony nodded, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a little lighter. "Thanks," he said, his voice filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. Nathan's routine interrupted. Meanwhile, Nathan was going about his day with his usual quiet efficiency. He had just returned from his morning walk when the phone rang. It wasn't a sound he heard often. Most of his communication these days was done in person or through the occasional email. He picked up the receiver, his voice steady and polite. "Hello, Mr. Wright," a familiar voice asked. It was Karen from the Veterans Center. "I just wanted to thank you for referring Tony to us. He stopped by this morning." Nathan felt a warm satisfaction spread through him. "That's good to hear," he said. "How did it go?" Karen hesitated for a moment before replying. "He seems determined, but he's also carrying a lot of baggage. It's not going to be an easy road for him." Nathan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "It never is," he said. "But he's got potential. I could see it in him." Karen smiled on the other end of the line. "I believe that too. We'll do our best to support him. Old friends, new challenges." That evening, Nathan found himself back at the diner, nursing a cup of coffee as the sun set behind the city skyline. He had always been a creature of habit, finding comfort in familiar routines. But tonight, his thoughts were with Tony, wondering how the young man was faring. As if on cue, the bell above the diner's door jingled, and Tony walked in. He looked more confident than the last time Nathan had seen him, though there was still a hint of uncertainty in his step. Spotting Nathan, he made his way to the booth and slid into the seat across from him. "Hey, Mr. Wright," Tony said, a small smile playing at his lips. Nathan raised an eyebrow. "Tony, twice in 1 week. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Tony chuckled, his hands fidgeting with the menu. "I just wanted to say thanks again," he said. "And to let you know I went to the center like you suggested." Nathan nodded, his expression one of quiet approval. "Good, and—" Tony hesitated before answering. "It was different. They didn't judge me, didn't make me feel like I was wasting their time. They actually seemed like they wanted to help." "They do," Nathan said simply. "But the real question is, do you want to help yourself?" Tony's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet determination. "Yeah," he said, "I do." A test of resolve. Over the next few weeks, Tony threw himself into the programs at the Veterans Center. He attended counseling sessions, participated in job training workshops, and even joined a support group for young men trying to break free from destructive lifestyles. It wasn't easy. There were days when he felt like giving up, when the weight of his past threatened to pull him back into the darkness. But whenever those moments came, he thought of Nathan, his calm strength, his unwavering belief in Tony's potential. It was enough to keep him going. Nathan, for his part, kept a watchful eye on Tony. He checked in regularly, offering words of encouragement and wisdom gleaned from his own experiences. Their relationship grew stronger, built on mutual respect and a shared determination to overcome life's challenges. The ripple effect. One day, as Nathan and Tony sat on a park bench, watching the world go by, Tony turned to Nathan with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "if you hadn't stopped me that night at the ATM, I don't even want to think about where I'd be right now." Nathan smiled faintly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sometimes all it takes is one moment," he said. "One decision to change the course of your life." Tony nodded, his gaze distant. "I want to do that for someone else someday," he said. "Help them the way you helped me." Nathan's smile grew wider. "That," he said, "is the best way to pay it forward." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a warm golden glow, the two men sat in companionable silence. For Tony, it was the first time in years that he felt truly at peace, and for Nathan, it was a reminder that even in his twilight years, he could still make a difference in the world, one person at a time, a step toward redemption. The weeks turned into months, and Tony's transformation was slow but noticeable. The Veterans Center had become a second home for him, a place where he found guidance, structure, and a growing sense of purpose. He had started working part-time at a local warehouse through a job placement program, and though the work was physically demanding, Tony embraced it. For the first time in years, he felt like he was moving forward. Nathan continued to watch from the sidelines, his pride in Tony's progress growing with each passing day. The bond between them had deepened, and though Nathan never pushed Tony to share more than he was ready to, the younger man often found himself opening up about his struggles, his regrets, and his hopes for the future. But change, as Nathan knew all too well, was never a straight path. And as Tony faced new challenges, he would soon learn that redemption wasn't just about changing his circumstances. It was about confronting his past. A ghost from the past. One chilly evening, as Tony was locking up the warehouse after a long shift, he heard a voice behind him that made his blood run cold. "Well, well, look who's gone, legend." Tony turned slowly, his heart pounding. Standing in the shadows was a figure he hadn't seen in months. Darius, an old acquaintance from his days on the streets. Darius was lean and wiry, with a predatory glint in his eye and a smirk that Tony had once found intimidating. "What do you want, Darius?" Tony asked, his voice steady despite the nervous knot in his stomach. Darius stepped closer, his hands stuffed casually in his pockets. "Just came to see if the rumors were true," he said. "Heard you've been playing the good boy lately. Working a 9 to 5. Going to church, staying out of trouble. That true?" Tony didn't answer, his jaw tightening. He didn't owe Darius an explanation. Darius chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, you really think you can just walk away? Like it's that easy. You and me, we've got history, Tony. You don't just get to wipe the slate clean." "I'm done with all that," Tony said firmly. "Whatever you think I owe you, I don't. I'm not that guy anymore." Darius's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. "You think you're better than me now," he sneered. "You think a little job and a couple of therapy sessions make you a saint. Let me tell you something, Tony. Guys like us don't get second chances. You're just fooling yourself." Tony clenched his fists, his body tense. He wanted to argue, to prove Darius wrong, but he knew it wouldn't matter. People like Darius didn't listen to words. They only understood actions. Seeking wisdom. After Darius left, Tony felt the familiar weight of doubt creeping back into his mind. He had worked so hard to build a new life, but in a matter of minutes, Darius had made him question everything. Was he really capable of change, or was he just pretending? Would his past always follow him, no matter how far he tried to run? The next morning, Tony found himself at Nathan's front porch. The older man was sitting in his rocking chair, a steamy mug of coffee in his hand and a blanket draped over his knees. He looked up as Tony approached, his expression warm but curious. "Morning, Tony," Nathan said. "You're up early." Tony hesitated, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "Can we talk?" he asked. Nathan gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Of course." As Tony sat down, he recounted the encounter with Darius, his words tumbling out in a rush. He told Nathan about the things Darius had said, the doubts they had stirred, and the fear that he would never truly escape his past. Nathan listened silently, his eyes fixed on Tony with a steady intensity. When Tony finished, Nathan set his mug down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Tony," he said, his voice calm and measured, "your past is a part of you, but it doesn't define you. The choices you've made since that night at the ATM, that's what defines you. And you've been making the right choices, even when it's hard. That takes strength." "But what if he's right?" Tony asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I'm just pretending? What if I can't do this?" Nathan's expression softened, and he placed a reassuring hand on Tony's shoulder. "Pretending wouldn't have brought you this far," he said. "And as for not being able to do this, you already are. Every day you show up to work, every time you choose to walk away from the old life, you're proving to yourself and everyone else that you're capable of change. A test of character." A few days later, Tony faced another challenge. While unloading a shipment at the warehouse, he overheard two coworkers talking about a missing item. It was a high-end electronic device, and the manager was furious about the loss. Tony's heart sank as he realized what had happened. One of the younger employees, a kid fresh out of high school, had pocketed the device and was now panicking as the theft was being investigated. Tony recognized the fear in the boy's eyes. It was the same fear he had felt countless times in his own past. Tony knew what he had to do. He pulled the boy aside and spoke to him quietly but firmly. "Look, I know what you did," he said, "and I get it, but this isn't the way. If you don't come clean, it's only going to get worse." The boy's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded reluctantly. With Tony's support, he returned the stolen item to the manager and apologized. Though the boy faced consequences, the manager was impressed by Tony's leadership and willingness to guide the younger employee. Recognition and reflection. That evening, as Tony walked home, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. For the first time, he had been the one offering guidance instead of needing it. He thought of Nathan and all the lessons the older man had taught him. It wasn't just about making better choices, it was about helping others do the same. When Tony reached his small apartment, he found a letter waiting for him in the mailbox. It was from the Veterans Center, inviting him to speak at an upcoming event about his journey of transformation. Tony stared at the letter, his heart pounding. Public speaking wasn't something he had ever considered, but the idea of sharing his story and inspiring others filled him with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. Tony picked up the phone and dialed Nathan's number. When the older man answered, Tony couldn't keep the excitement out of his voice. "They want me to speak at an event," he said. "Me, of all people." Nathan chuckled, his voice warm with pride. "Of course they do," he said. "You've got a story worth telling, Tony. And I'll be there, front and center, to hear it." As Tony hung up the phone, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known in years. He wasn't just running from his past anymore. He was building a future. And for the first time, he believed he deserved it. The power of redemption. The auditorium at the Veterans Center was bustling with energy on the night of the event. Rows of chairs faced a modest stage, where a simple podium stood adorned with a microphone and the center's logo. People from all walks of life filled the room: veterans, community members, and young individuals searching for guidance. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, each person eager to hear the stories of resilience and transformation. In the middle row, Nathan sat quietly, his posture straight and proud. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd, but his thoughts were fixed on Tony. He'd watched the young man grow over the past few months, shedding layers of doubt and fear to become someone capable of not only changing his own life, but inspiring others to do the same. Tonight, Tony would stand on that stage and share his story, a testament to how far he had come. A moment of hesitation. Backstage, Tony paced nervously, the palms of his hands damp with sweat. He had spent days rehearsing his speech, pouring his heart into every word. But now that the moment was here, doubt threatened to consume him. Could he really stand in front of all those people and bare his soul? What if they judged him? What if they saw him as nothing more than the person he used to be? Karen, the counselor from the Veterans Center, approached him with a reassuring smile. "You're going to do great," she said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Just speak from the heart. People don't want perfection. They want honesty." Tony nodded, though his nerves still churned. He glanced at the small mirror on the wall, catching his reflection. The man staring back at him looked different, stronger, more confident, but the memories of his past lingered like shadows, whispering that he didn't belong here. Taking a deep breath, Tony closed his eyes and thought of Nathan. He thought of the old man's calm wisdom, his unwavering belief in Tony's potential. If Nathan could see something worth saving in him, then maybe it was time he saw it too. The story unfolds. When Tony stepped onto the stage, the applause that greeted him was polite but subdued. The audience didn't know him yet. He was just another name on the program. He adjusted the microphone, his hands trembling slightly, and took a deep breath. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "My name is Tony Carter, and if you had met me a year ago, you probably wouldn't recognize the man standing here today." The room fell silent as Tony launched into his story. He spoke about his childhood, growing up in a neighborhood where survival often meant making tough choices. He talked about the mistakes he had made, the paths he had taken that led him further and further from the person he wanted to be. He didn't shy away from the ugly parts, the thefts, the confrontations, the moments when he felt like giving up entirely. "But then," Tony said, his voice softening, "I met someone who changed everything. An old man who should have been my victim, but instead became my mentor." Nathan's breath hitched, his chest swelling with pride as Tony continued. A life turned around. Tony recounted the night he met Nathan, how the older man had disarmed him not with force, but with wisdom and compassion. He spoke about the card Nathan had handed him, the nudge that led him to the Veterans Center, and the steps he had taken since then to rebuild his life. "I'm not here to tell you I've got it all figured out," Tony admitted, his eyes scanning the crowd. "I'm still learning, still trying. But what I've learned is this: it's never too late to change. No matter how far you've fallen, there's always a way back." The audience hung on his every word, the weight of his honesty resonating deeply. For some, his story was a mirror of their own struggles. For others, it was a reminder of the power of second chances. Tony closed his speech with a message of hope. "If there's one thing I want you to take away from my story, it's this. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to lean on people who believe in you, even when you don't believe in yourself. Because those people, the ones who see the best in you, they're the reason I'm standing here today." As he stepped back from the podium, the room erupted into applause. The sound was thunderous, a wave of appreciation and admiration that left Tony momentarily stunned. He glanced out into the crowd and saw Nathan standing, his hands clapping vigorously, a proud smile lighting up his face. A quiet conversation. After the event, Tony found Nathan outside the auditorium, leaning against the railing of a small patio that overlooked the city. The older man turned as Tony approached, his smile widening. "You did good, kid," Nathan said, his voice warm with pride. Tony leaned against the railing beside him, his gaze fixed on the twinkling lights of the city. "I wasn't sure I could do it," he admitted. "But once I started talking, it all just came out." Nathan chuckled softly. "That's because it was real," he said. "People can tell when someone's being honest. And tonight, you gave them something to believe in." Tony nodded, the weight of the evening settling over him. "I just hope I can live up to it," he said. "I don't want to let anyone down." Nathan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're not going to let anyone down," he said, "because you're not doing this for them. You're doing it for yourself. And as long as you keep moving forward, you're already winning." The ripple effect. In the weeks that followed, Tony's speech became the talk of the Veterans Center. People who had been hesitant to seek help began attending programs, inspired by Tony's journey. He became something of a mentor himself, offering guidance and encouragement to those who were just starting their own paths to redemption. But Tony didn't let the praise go to his head. He continued to work hard, both at his job and on himself. He stayed connected to Nathan, visiting the older man regularly to share updates and seek advice. Their bond grew stronger, a testament to the power of compassion and the impact one person can have on another's life. For Nathan, seeing Tony thrive was the ultimate reward. In his twilight years, he had found a renewed sense of purpose, not just in helping Tony, but in knowing that the young man's story would inspire others for years to come. A new legacy. One evening, as they sat on Nathan's porch, Tony turned to the older man with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "if it weren't for you, I don't think I'd be here right now." Nathan smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Maybe," he said, "but don't sell yourself short, Tony. You did the hard work. I just gave you a little push." Tony nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "Still," he said, "I hope I can be that push for someone else someday. I want to do for them what you did for me." Nathan's smile widened, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "You already are," he said, "and I couldn't be prouder." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a warm golden glow, Tony felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living, and with Nathan by his side, he knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. For both men, the journey was far from over. But as they sat together, two lives forever intertwined, they knew they had already won the greatest battle of all, the fight for redemption.